My name is Arden Hale. I'm 34 years old, and people tell me I walk into rooms like I already know the exits. Years in the military, then auditing for a Manhattan firm. Will do that to you. I've built my life on discipline, control, and paper trails because paper doesn't lie, even when people do. I hadn't been back to Columbus in 11 years, not since I left with 2 suitcases and a scholarship, promising myself I'd never step foot on Maple Street again. But a phone call from my grandmother, Theen, steady voice telling me Grandpa was gone, pulled me back. So I boarded the first flight home, my carry-on stuffed with legal documents instead of clothes. The house looked smaller than I remembered. Shutters faded, garden stripped bare. I stood at the bottom of the porch steps, heart pounding harder than I expected. When the door opened, Arden, my mother's voice cracked. She pulled me into a hug, smelling faintly of cigarette smoke and lavender lotion. Her tears dampened my collar, and for a fleeting second, I thought maybe I'd been wrong to stay away so long. Then his shadow filled the doorway. "Welcome back," Dad said. His breath reeked of bourbon before I could answer. His fist came across my face, snapping my head sideways. The sting burned, sharp and humiliating, but worse was the way Mom froze, eyes darting away as if nothing had happened. I steadied myself, lifted my chin. "This isn't your house anymore," he sneered. I didn't argue. My fingers brushed the bag hanging from my shoulder. Inside was every page he hadn't read, every signature he couldn't erase. The deed was still mine. I stepped past him into the hallway, the air stale with smoke and secrets, and saw what else had changed. The hallway was darker than I remembered, the old sconces casting a yellow glow over walls that no longer held our family pictures, where my father's proud smile had once looked down from a frame in uniform. There was now a mounted deer head, its glass eyes catching the light in a way that made my stomach twist. I moved slowly, tracing the edges of what used to be home. The hardwood floors he had refinished by hand were scuffed and dulled, sticky under my shoes. The scent of bourbon and cigarettes clung to the air, thick enough to choke. Mom's voice trembled behind me. "It's been so long. Arden, things change." I turned, catching her eyes for a moment before she dropped them to the floor. That avoidance was sharper than the sting still blooming on my cheek. She smoothed her shirt nervously, like a child caught in a lie, and busied herself with nothing at all. Through the doorway, I saw him sprawled in my father's recliner, the same chair I'd once climbed into on Sunday afternoons to watch football at Dad's side. Now, reupholstered in camouflage fabric, it sagged under the weight of a man who looked like he belonged anywhere but here. "Look who finally decided to show up," Dad said, voice booming, claiming the space. He didn't stand, didn't move, just tightened his grip around a beer bottle. I bit back a reply, forcing myself to study the room instead. The bookshelves my father had built were gone, replaced by particle board units stacked with cheap hunting trophies. Even the basketball hoop outside, the one Dad had put up for my 13th birthday, had vanished out the window. I caught sight of gravel where a garden used to bloom rows of tomatoes my father had planted every spring. The losses piled up with each glance, but beneath the ache came something steadier. Resentment, yes, but also resolve. I had the papers in my bag, proof that not everything here could be overwritten. I let my hand rest on the strap, silent, while he smirked at me from my father's chair. Let him think he'd won this house. For now. I climbed the stairs, each step heavier than the last, bracing myself for the next room that used to be mine. A week earlier, my office windows looked out over Midtown Manhattan, glass towers cutting the winter sky into sharp edges. My desk was covered in audit reports, columns of numbers that made sense in a way family never had. I was halfway through reviewing a client's expense trail when my phone buzzed. The caller ID read Grandma Hale. Her voice was thinner than I remembered, but steady. "Arden, your grandfather passed this morning." I closed my eyes, pressing 2 fingers to my temple. The ache that spread wasn't grief exactly, more like the crack of an old wound. Grandpa had been the one who taught me how to read contracts before I signed them, who slid his pocket magnifier across the kitchen table and said, "Details matter more than promises." "The memorial is Saturday," she said. "You need to come home." The words lodged in my throat. Columbus was a place I'd sealed off, a locked drawer in my mind. 11 years of distance wasn't an accident. I had sworn off Maple Street the day I left with scholarship papers in one hand and a bus ticket in the other. "I don't know if I can," I started, my voice colder than I meant. She let a pause stretch between us. Then, softer, "You need to see this with your own eyes." Something in her tone snagged me, not just grief, but warning. I swiveled in my chair, staring at the skyline I had fought for. Everything in New York was built on my choices. Going back meant walking into a house full of the choices I hadn't made. By the end of the call, I had already logged into the airline portal. The flight from LaGuardia to Columbus was 2 hours, 2 hours to undo 11 years of distance. I didn't pack much black suit, small bag, and a folder of documents I'd never shown anyone, because even before I left, some part of me knew this homecoming wouldn't be about grief alone. The house went quiet after dinner, though quiet here didn't mean peace. It meant the low hum of the television from the living room, a bottle opening, the heavy drag of Dad's voice echoing between walls that once carried laughter. I stayed in the cramped storage room that had been offered as my space, staring at the pull-out couch shoved between boxes of his trophies. I should have left for a hotel, but something in me wanted to endure the night, to see just how far the rot had spread. It didn't take long. Around 11, footsteps thudded in the hallway. His shadow blocked the crack under the door. Still awake. "Princess." His tone was mocking, sharp with drink, before I could answer. The door creaked open. He stepped inside, swaying slightly. "This is my house. You don't just waltz in after 11 years and act like you belong." "I don't need to act," I said evenly. "I know where I belong." The slap came fast, a blur of movement. My cheek lit up with fire, the taste of metal filling my mouth. At the doorway, my mother's silhouette flickered in the hall light. She froze, one hand gripping the frame, then turned her face away. "It's late," she murmured, voice brittle. "Don't wake the neighbors." And then she disappeared into the dark, closing her bedroom door as if that erased what she'd seen. The silence after hurt more than the strike. I sat down slowly on the edge of the couch, my cheek throbbing. Old instincts from my service years slid into place. I reached for my phone, switched the camera to selfie mode, and captured the bruise from 3 angles. Then I opened the secure app my firm used for sensitive reports, time-stamped each photo, and filed a detailed log. "Always document." I heard my grandfather's voice in memory. "Always keep copies. Don't let anyone tell you what's yours without proof." My reflection in the phone looked harder than I remembered, not broken, not even surprised, just ready. I locked the entry, slid the phone under my pillow, and lay back, eyes open in the dark. The slap had been meant to remind me I didn't belong. All it did was confirm how much I still did. Morning light revealed more than I wanted to see. The kitchen table was buried under unopened envelopes, a mountain of bills shoved aside like they might disappear if ignored. I sat down, pulling one after another into a neat stack. Mortgage late notices, utility shutoff warnings, property tax reminders stamped in red. When Mom shuffled in, she froze. "Arden, leave those. Your father handles it." I held up a statement with his scrawl across the signature line. The handwriting was close, but not hers. I'd seen her true signature enough on school forms and birthday checks to know the difference. This one was heavier, unsteady, trying too hard. "Did you sign this loan renewal?" Her eyes darted to the coffee pot. "He said we needed it for repairs." "He told me." "So you didn't sign it." Her silence was answer enough. Dad's voice cut in from the living room. Don't start with your big city suspicion games. This house needed fixing, and I fixed it. New garage, new office, costs money. I looked past him through the window. The so-called repairs were cosmetic at best, an oversized garage swallowing half the yard. Particle board shelves where my father's craftsmanship once stood. None of it justified thousands in loans. You call this fixing, I muttered. But he only smirked, taking a long pull from his beer. By noon, I'd filled half a folder with copies, photographing each one with my phone. The paper trail was unraveling faster than even I expected. Still, it wasn't enough. I needed proof of where the money went. That came from across the street. Mrs. Patterson, the neighbor who used to sneak me cookies when I was a child, intercepted me on the porch. Her hair was grayer, but her eyes still sharp. I shouldn't get involved, she whispered, pressing a small envelope into my hand. But someone had to keep records. Inside were photos taken quietly from her front yard of our belongings laid out at garage sales. My father's coin collection spread across a folding table. My grandmother's china in mismatched boxes. Even my childhood sketches piled like trash. He said it was storage unit stuff, she said, lips tightening. But I knew better. The images blurred as I flipped through them, fury tightening in my chest. They weren't just selling objects, they were selling memory, history, everything my father had built. I slid the photos into my folder beside the forged signatures and overdue notices. The story they told was undeniable, and I was just beginning to gather the pieces. I found Jonathan Morrison's office in a brick building 2 blocks from the courthouse. The nameplate on the frosted glass door looked worn but solid, much like the man who rose to greet me. He was in his 60s, hair thinning at the crown, tie slightly askew, but his handshake was steady. "Your grandmother called ahead," he said, motioning me into a chair. "She said you'd be bringing me something important." I set the folder on his desk. Bills, forged renewals, pawn slips, photos. He spread them out in neat rows, reading every page without rushing. His silence stretched, broken only by the scratch of his pen as he made notes. Finally, he looked up. "This is substantial. You co-signed the original mortgage with your mother." "Yes, 19 years old. Military scholarship. I knew just enough about contracts to protect us." I added a clause, no major changes without both signatures. He nodded, impressed. "That clause is still binding. And these signatures on the refinancing documents, not yours. And I'd wager not your mother's either." "They're his," I said flatly. Morrison leaned back. "Then we have grounds for an emergency injunction. We can ask the judge to freeze all property transfers and require court oversight before anything moves further. It will buy us time and keep him from selling off what's left." That afternoon, we stood in front of Judge Harrison, a man with sharp glasses and a voice that carried authority without needing volume. Morrison handed him the binder of evidence. My photos of the bruise were on top. The judge flipped through, expression tightening. "Injunction granted," he said, signing with a swift stroke. "No sale, no transfer, no disposal of assets until review. Miss Hale, you'll have lawful access to secure the property, accompanied by sheriff's deputies." The words landed like a gavel inside me. Official, real. This wasn't just family ugliness hidden behind closed doors anymore. It was law. Outside the courtroom, Morrison handed me a copy of the order. "The sheriff will meet us tomorrow morning. Be prepared, he won't take this quietly." I folded the papers carefully, tucking them back into my bag where the deed already rested. For years, I had carried proof as a precaution. Now it was my weapon. The line had been drawn. My house. My rules was about to meet the weight of the state of Ohio. The call came while I was organizing the injunction papers at the hotel desk. Mrs. Davies, the elementary school principal where my mother still worked, spoke in a clipped, worried tone. "Arden, I thought you should know. Your father just made a scene here." I was in the car before she finished the sentence. By the time I reached the school, the scene had already unraveled. Staff stood in small knots near the entrance, whispering, while a security guard loitered by the door. Inside, I found Mom in the main office, her face blotched red, clutching a stack of folders like a shield. He was shouting in the lobby. Mrs. Davies explained quietly, yelling about ungrateful daughters, stolen property. We had to escort him out. I looked at Mom, but she avoided my eyes, trembling hands adjusting the papers that didn't need adjusting. The humiliation sat heavy on her shoulders. "This isn't just my fight anymore," I said gently. Her lips pressed together, a crack forming in her practiced silence. Later, back at the hotel, she arrived at my door. She carried nothing but her purse and a look I'd never seen on her before, defeat mixed with something sharper. "I can't live like this," she whispered. "Everyone saw. He made me small in front of people I've worked with for 15 years. I opened the folder that Morrison had prepared, the restoration agreement. It restored the house to its original ownership structure, with protective clauses against further loans or transfers. Mom would have lifetime residency. But Rick's control would end. Her hand hovered over the pen. "If he finds out, he already knows he's losing," I said. For a long moment, she sat still. Then she signed. The strokes were shaky, but they cut through years of silence. When she slid the papers back across the table, I felt the balance shift. Not a victory yet, but a fracture in the wall he had built around her. She wiped her eyes quickly. "Don't tell him I signed tonight." I nodded. For now, it was enough that she had a single page, but the first real crack in his control. The contractors started early, their hammers and saws echoing through the hollowed rooms. Dust floated in the beams of morning light, turning the house into something both broken and alive. I walked them through each space, pointing out where my father's craftsmanship had been stripped away. James, the lead carpenter, paused in the basement and tapped a section of wall. "Doesn't sound right," he murmured. Minutes later, plaster gave way to reveal a narrow compartment. Inside, wrapped in a plastic sleeve, lay a bundle of papers and an envelope marked with my name in handwriting I knew by heart. I sat on the steps, fingers trembling as I unfolded the letter. My father's words spilled out, written before his last deployment, his pride in me, his warnings about the house, his plea not to let anyone take it from us. "This place is more than wood and nails. Arden, it's our history. Guard it." Tears blurred the ink, but for the first time in years, I felt him close. That evening, another knock came. Katie Williams. She stood on the porch in civilian clothes, carrying a small box. "I served with your dad," she said simply. "He trusted me to hold these for you and your mom if anything happened." Inside were journals, photos, his watch. She met my gaze steadily. There were rumors. Rick twisted them. "But your father never betrayed his family. He talked about you and Lydia constantly. He loved you both." Mom appeared in the doorway, hesitant until Katie pressed a sealed envelope into her hands. I watched as Mom read, tears running unchecked. Her expression softened into something I hadn't seen in years, a kind of release. When she looked up, her voice cracked. "Your father never left us. Arden, I did. But I want to come back." I reached for her hand. The letter still warm in mine, between the sawdust, the hammers, and the words of the man who built this house. Something inside us began to mend. The evidence spread across Morrison's polished desk like a map of rot. Receipts, pawn slips, forged signatures, every careless move my father thought he could bury, now laid out in the open. Morrison slid the folder toward him during the plea negotiations. "You've run out of ground to stand on," he said evenly. Dad's bravado cracked. The threats, the sneers, even the drunken bluster gone. He slumped in the chair as the terms were read. Full restitution. Signed confession. Prison time. He tried to glance at Mom for sympathy, but she didn't meet his eyes. When the pen touched paper, it was the first honest thing he'd done in years. Days later, Dad's army buddies began showing up one by one, carrying pieces of the past he had pawned, a medal wrapped in a velvet box, a combat knife, a field jacket still smelling faintly of sand and oil. Each man placed their offering on the dining table, shaking my hand with quiet solidarity. He told us lies. One said, "But your father's truth is safe now." The community, too, rallied around us. Neighbors dropped by with casseroles, stories, and sympathy. For the first time since returning, I felt the weight of Rick's isolation lift. We weren't alone. That night, I sat with Mom at the kitchen table. Between us lay the signed restoration agreement and the letter from Dad I kept folded in my pocket. "You'll have lifetime residency here," I told her. "This will always be your home. But there are rules now, boundaries. No more men like him dictating what happens under this roof." She nodded, tears shimmering but unspilled. I understand. I believed she did. The house could be rebuilt with timber and nails. The family inside it would take longer, but at least now, we had a foundation strong enough to try. 3 weeks later, the house no longer felt like a ruin. The built-ins stood tall again in the living room, each shelf crafted with the same care my father had once poured into them. The floors gleamed, warm oak restored to its rightful shine. Even the dining table had been sanded and refinished, ready to hold family meals instead of neglect. That night, Mom and I set the table together. No takeout cartons, no frozen dinners microwaved in silence. She had cooked pot roast, potatoes, and green beans, just like she used to before Rick's shadow fell across the house. We ate slowly, savoring not just the food, but the quiet dignity of sitting down as mother and daughter without fear. Afterward, I pulled out my laptop in the living room, finishing a report for my firm. New York was still my world, but I knew now this house would be part of it too. I wouldn't abandon the career I'd built, but I would balance it with stewardship, renting the place to a good family, overseeing its care, making sure no one ever again claimed it wasn't mine. Later, we stepped onto the porch. The air was cool, the stars clear over Columbus. I poured us each a small glass of wine. Raising mine, I looked at Mom, then at the house behind us, glowing softly with its new life. To Dad, I said quietly, "For building more than a home, for building something worth protecting." Mom touched her glass to mine, her smile fragile but real. I sipped slowly, letting the weight of the moment settle. The house stood steady behind us, no longer a battlefield, but our house rebuilt, reclaimed, and alive again.